Thank you. So welcome everyone to this Equilibrium Network event, which is being run under the umbrella of the Wonderful Diversity Project, which is a 4-year initiative that has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020. My name is Caroline Cole, and I have the pleasure of chairing this event. We have about an hour and a half to play with, and we have 5 speakers chosen to get your minds racing. Each will talk for around 10 minutes, and we will follow this with a questions and answer session. If you would like to ask a question, please add it into the Q&A function, and we will do our best to ensure that all the topics get aired. For those of you who are new to the Equilibrium Network, we are an international multidisciplinary network which now has between 400 and 500 members. The network includes architects, engineers, landscape architects, contractors, surveyors, policymakers and urbanists, as well as those working in client organizations, so developers and public sector organizations and cities, academia and institutes. And our aim is simple: to enable women to have equal influence in the design and delivery of the built environment. To help us achieve our aims, we've got 5 objectives. The first is to address the fallout of women working within the industries that create our towns and cities. The second is to increase the number of women at the top of organizations that create and shape our towns and cities. The third, to influence the industry to ensure that it delivers diversity and inclusion with a particular emphasis on women. Fourthly, to promote the needs, preferences, and aspirations of women in the design of our towns and cities. And finally, to bring our network to an international audience. In support of our objectives, we undertake research, we develop strategic advice, we run events, of which this is one. This is the Equilibrium Network's first major event under the umbrella of the Diversity Project. We are one of the 26 consortium members who make up diversity, and fellow consortium members include 5 cities across Europe: Aarhus, Bucharest, Castillon, Orvieto, and Potsdam. And we are especially delighted to welcome to this event people who are working to create the built environment in those cities, as well as, of course, our international friends from across the consortium and our other network members. Diversity is an ambitious project with a focus on gender and on air quality through nature-based solutions. It aims to harness the power of diversity and inclusion for climate-neutral cities, shifting the urban paradigm by valuing human diversity as a resource that can help define new urban services and models for culturally driven green cities. So before we get going, I'd like to confirm that we will be recording this session and we will make it available through our website, so it will be a reference point and a useful tool going forward. We are here to discuss the influence of women in city making, and I am privileged to introduce you to 5 amazing, influential players who have been influential in making our cities to date, and who have each agreed to contribute a 10-minute provocation to get the conversation moving. We start with Peter Murray, OBE. Peter Murray is co-founder of New London Architecture. He has a background in architecture, journalism, and design. He is also chairman of the Temple Bar Trust and past master of the Worshipful Company of Chartered Architects. He is a keen cyclist and he campaigns for safer cycling and healthier cities. In 2006, he cycled to Cannes for the MIPIM real estate show held there every March. And this has grown, into an annual ride comprising architects, developers and consultants who raise over £250,000 each year for charity. He is a regular commentator and broadcaster on London issues and has written numerous books, including The Saga of Sydney Opera House, London's Growing Up, and Great Estates. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And yes, as you heard, I'm the co-founder of New London Architecture, which for those who aren't in London is a membership organisation. We have members who are architects, developers from local borough councils, engineers and project managers right across the industry, and we've been going since 2005. We have regular events and seminars and Zoom events rather like this one. And I thought it'd be quite interesting to go back to some of the early days of NLA to have a look at our speakers. And could I have the first slide, please? So this is a panel which I found on Flickr. I went through all our Flickr pictures, and this was a panel of 2008. And as you can see, it's pretty male-oriented, nice liberal chaps. But actually, that was, I would say, even not that long ago, relatively normal. And that we would ask companies often to say, can you send a speaker on such and such a topic? And we'd be then directed to the usually male partner who would be keen to speak. And even when we would ask women within those firms, would they like to do it? They often felt that it wasn't their place to do it, and they sent us back to the partner again. So it wasn't for want of trying from our point of view, and we persevered. And I would say in the early days we had a majority of speakers, and then as time went on, and we would get regularly criticized by a number of people on Twitter if they would see that we didn't have enough representation of women. We would be criticized, which actually was slightly off-putting at the start, but then we realized it was a very good thing of making us to try harder. So we did then get up pretty regularly to 30% women in the sort of 2015 or so. And we did a whole series of programs also to just encourage those who were slightly nervous about public speaking to come on board and take part. And so then if we can have the next slide, this was actually from our Flickr page. That was from February this year. And it's not only, of course, is diverse from a gender point of view, but also from an ethnicity point of view, and diversity right across the spectrum is very much a part of our strategy, and it is now working pretty well within our membership. But I've actually just come back from a lunch at the Future Build conference at Excel in East London, and there was a lunch of 20 people, of which 2 were women, and everybody was white. So the construction industry more generally has a lot of work still to do, both in terms of how it creates representation, but also who it encourages to actually become part of the industry. And I was a Mayor's Design Advocate. For those who aren't Londoners, Mayor's Design Advocates, group of 50 or so people involved with the design who advise the mayor on issues around design and procurement. And this was in the first cohort of design advocates. And as a part of that, we put together and supported the good growth by design policy, which Sadiq Khan, as mayor of London, was integrating into the London plan. There was the supporting diversity pillar, which recognised the need for specific and practical guidance, really, to address the lack of diversity across the built environment sector. And that's really the only way that we can deliver a city that works better for all Londoners, which was a key part of the good growth by design strategy. And one of the other events that I'm involved with is the London Festival of Architecture. And in 2018, the festival worked together with the GLA to commission a report on London's architecture sector, which was both about its economic impact on the capital, but also its diversity. And that really highlighted the problems that were still being faced about the lack of diversity within the sector. And that report now actually is about to be updated. So hopefully in next few months, we will actually have some quite hard data on how the sector has improved over the years to create a more diverse cohort. And that first report highlighted that London does have a pretty extraordinary concentration of world-class architecture, urban planning, engineering, and development skills. But despite this profile and its influence, actually, on our daily lives, women and people of colour are still underrepresented in the built environment professions, and this is particularly the case in senior positions. And the image and, I'd say, lived experience of architecture is a sort of white and male profession is still too prevalent. And so one of the things that we did at NLA was to launch a diverse leaders pledge back in that was in October 2020, and we did that in collaboration with 17 other organizations, including those like Real Estate Balance, Women in Property, and Women in Planning. And that was dedicated to helping make the built environment sector more representative through recruitment, progression, and also advocacy. So that pledge, it allows businesses to commit to measurable goals over the coming years to increase the speed of change, and it also helps enable engagement, action, as well as progress around diversity and inclusion within the workplace. So we invited industry leaders to join us in making that pledge to help make the built environment sector more representative, and that has now been in place, I say, for just over 3 years now. And we also have set up a NLA Diverse Leaders Committee, and that's led by Deepa Joshi, who's a partner in the architects of Fletcher Priest, and that focuses both on gender and ethnicity. And Deepa was also, at the same time as me, a mayor's design advocate, and she actually wrote the Greater London Authority Handbook on supporting diversity. And she also works, as I say, at Fletcher Priest, where she is their diversity champion too, and she steers the practices of EDI strategy and action plan, and her mantra is measure, monitor, and mentor, the 3 M's. But the NLA committee that again aims to widen the industry's catchment of candidates at all levels, really, try and move away from unconscious bias and appreciate the opportunities presented by a diverse team. And so we feel that this will unlock a huge potential to design better quality, inclusive built environments with environmental value, economic value, and social value. And it should make an impact across all levels, really, from attracting school pupils to breaking glass ceilings in the upper echelons of management. So we'll be using that MMM strategy within the NLA program, creating a clear aim for us, really, in what we call the New London agenda, how London needs to change to bring about positive improvements in the way the city works. So we'll be giving recruitment interview guidance which would provide a helpful resource with providing sort of baseline EDI training, including induction for members. So whether it's funders, councillors, developers, or designers, the more voices that are heard within the environment sector, the more resilient the developments it produces will be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I like the idea of measure, monitor, and mentor. A good mantra for people to think about. We're now going to hear from Mina Hasman. Mina leads SOM's sustainability and well-being daily operations and long-term vision of achieving excellence in practice. She has experience in a wide variety of projects in Europe, UK, Middle East, and Asia, bringing a greater understanding of the implications for sustainability and equitable design in different climatic, social, and regulatory contexts. As a recognized expert in her field, Mina regularly contributes to the wider climate change, sustainability, and well-being debate. Through her role as a tutor at various academic institutions, through regular speaking appearances at many international events, and through her roles on numerous boards and policy committees, including with the UK GBC, the RIBA, LETI, the CIC, CIBC, UNEP Global ABC, and IWBI. She is the author of a new book, RIBA Climate Guide, due to be published this month. Mina.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Caroline. And thank you also for inviting me to be a part of this exciting and very important event. Today, I wanted to focus on the role of women in delivering responsive, conscious, and collective built environments, as well as related actions through countries all around the world. I also wanted to touch upon the importance of not only their holistic approach to complex challenges, but also their sometimes unique and often very effective communication skills and advocacy that continue to capture key and sensitive messages, which help advance critical agendas of social equity and health concerns, as well as climate emergency, among others. When we look at the history, in history, we observe that while the built environment of cities traditionally revolved around hard morphologies and monuments, women have carried out placemaking in ways that rehumanized even the most degraded post-industrial sites. Strategies introduced by Alessandra Cianchetta for the master plan for La Défense in Paris, France, opened up close infrastructures and knit together districts that promoted a greater equity, embracing diversity within rich communities of the city. Alison Brooks' award-winning housing design, the new Hall B at Harlow, Essex, also asserted new geometries and created a greater permeability with nature for high-density living spaces that people often have been deprived of. And more recently, in one of our own projects at SOM, the new United Nations Permanent Office Building, which was led by women leaders for design, management, and sustainability, has really yielded to an outcome of long-term direct value to its occupants, as well as the wider UN community in their beautiful Geneva campus. Working within a construction industry that is very much focused on short-term profit, this commitment to long-term value is often hard to uphold and pursue. But from the macro scale of the city regions to the micro scale of individual buildings, as shown in the previous examples, women continue to draw out holistic solutions that really balance equity, diversity, and prosperity of the society, environment, and economy collectively. Our profession as designers and architects concerns that which makes land a landscape, and the resilience of the environment, as well as the people who inhabit it, that create communities in all their diversity and density. It really revolves around creative ways of how to stimulate the stewardship of the city's natural capital. And I would say that this has been even more evident in the recent years in the way women respond to multitude of crises we have been experiencing in order to create a more just and sustainable world for us all. If I may focus on the climate change crisis alone, examples of women stepping up in the recent years to really make a difference have been inspirational to many of us around the world. As hurricanes became more severe and prevalent, Indigenous women in Nicaragua were motivated to create seed banks to protect their local biodiversity, creating a sustainable livelihoods that are not dependent upon industrialized agriculture. And when we look at an example in cities in Bangladesh, women created wind and flood resilient housing foundations for their own communities to survive. Moreover, among the most notable female architects of our day, if I could say that way, Yasmin Larry has over the recent 2 decades been empowering especially the most vulnerable women in Pakistan to build their way out of the devastating effects of poverty and climate change. In addition to this sensitive approach and holistic responses to address contextual challenges, women's considerate, confident, and wide-reaching communication skills have also helped them deliver core messages surrounding climate change and its impacts, including social equity, health, and economic prosperity, which have been really critical in setting the foundations of meaningful and long value-adding initiatives. A clear example of this is the leadership and participation of women in actions that help limit global warming. Rachel Carson's seminal book, Silent Spring, which started the global environmental movement as we know it today, inspired generations of grassroots actions for the Earth, ultimately leading to the creation of the Earth Day in 1970 and the establishment of the US Environmental Protection Agency. On the political front, women in leadership have also utilized their position to define an entire country, and if not many countries' destiny and trajectory. After winning the re-election, New Zealand's Prime Minister Ardern and her cabinet, predominantly of women members, declared a climate emergency and set in motion a plan to make the country's public sector carbon neutral by 2025. And because of a legendary group of women on the other side, including Farhana Yamin, Christiana Figueres, and Tessa Tennant, we have come to understand the guiding principles of net zero carbon emissions today, which are ingrained in the Paris Agreement that is currently signed and supported by more than 197 countries around the world. And it was with these precise targets and principles, as well as clear language, that allowed global leaders to finally understand the urgency and begin to collaborate to create actionable policies around climate change. In all of these brief examples that I have shared, women have either taken advantage of their powerful positions to accelerate a positive change within the built environment sector and beyond, or created such opportunities themselves with their conscious, consistent, and collaborative approach. Their careful and strategic conveyance of critical messages through their effective communication and advocacy, as well as their collaborative nature, I believe, have been the core ingredients of their success, which we can all continue to take inspiration from every day. Thank you. Caroline, we're unable to hear you.
Sorry, here I am rambling away. I thank you so much, Mina, for that lovely talk and for the really inspirational figures that you brought to the table. And I think the fascinating thing is how that collaborative approach that seems to be natural to women is something that is starting to get under the skin of even some of the biggest political issues of the day. We will now hear from Susanna. Susanna Walker has had a very varied career, including working in museums, as a TV producer for the BBC and Channel 4, and she has also written several books. She became quite outraged when she realized that not only had her local council only provided outdoor facilities for teenage boys, but they didn't propose to do anything about redressing the balance. She particularly enjoys gathering data and finding great examples of spaces for teenage girls from other countries. Susanna.
Thank you. This works. Hurrah. Thank you very much for having me. I didn't realize it was a provocation. I was told to be positive. I was going to do a provocation. I'd show you my statistics on who uses pitches. But anyway, let's not go there. Thank you so much for having me here. What Make Space for Girls is about is really summed up by the quote on the screen. When we were first thinking about starting the charity and whether there should be a campaign of some kind, I was obviously talking to a lot of teenage girls about how they felt about parks and public spaces. And Lily was the daughter of a friend of mine. And I said, well, do you go to the park? And she just gave me the 14-year-old dead-eyed, 1,000-yard stare and went, why would I? There's nothing there for me. And that's pretty accurate sum up of the situation, and a pretty accurate, we're going to have fun with mice, I can see. Sorry. Dear, what is happening? Except I have a stupid mouse. So sorry about this. I'll try and regain. Yes, so we're here to try and create spaces that work for teenage girls, because at the moment, that's not how things are working. This is our dream. So this is the positive thing. This is what we want to see. A park that is full of opportunities for teenage girls, whether they want to sit quietly, whether they want to be active, whether they want to be sporty, whether they want to be playful, whether they want to be with their friends, or whether they want to be on their own. Has somebody removed control for me? That's probably a good idea. Can I have the next slide, please? So, and also apologies because our slides have gone into reverse and nobody understands why. So what's the problem? Why do we not have this? At the moment, teenage girls don't really have anything for them, not just in parks, but in public spaces in general. And whenever we build facilities for teenagers, these are almost always the skate park, the Muga, the BMX track. This is kind of encoded in guidance and in planning. But all of these are massively dominated by boys. So the provision just isn't working for teenage girls. Next slide, please. What's the problem with this? Why do we need to change it? I mean, there's just a really basic question of fairness, of rights, and of discrimination. But it's kind of almost more important than that, because to be in public space is to be part of civic society, to belong to your community. And if you don't have a public space that welcomes you, what public space is basically saying to girls is that they belong at home. There's also a massive health impact. Teenage girls are less active than teenage boys at every stage of adolescence, but we never associate that with the fact that we don't give them anything to be active on. But also, we're increasingly realising how important access to green space is for mental health. There's a clear correlation in young people, and teenage girls are 3 times more likely than teenage boys to have a mental health disorder. So it's really important that we open up green space and public spaces for girls. They should believe they have safety is a really big barrier, and girls need to believe that they are safe and have a right to be in public space. There's also the law. I won't go into the because I know we've got a very international audience, the details of the Equality Act, although most countries have something similar. But the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child says that every child has a right to play up to the age of 18. And currently we're just not providing that for teenage girls. Next slide, please. So what do teenagers tell us about what they want? The great thing is that when you talk to them, they have really clear ideas. They see what the problem is. They want a space that's theirs. At the moment, there is nowhere, almost nowhere for teenage girls to go that says you are welcome. It's okay for you to be there. The facilities that are problematic, like Moogers and skate parks, do that really well for teenage boys. Nobody's ever going to clear a teenage boy off a skate park for loitering. So we need something that creates a space for girls in that way. They actually want to be in public places. They don't want to be tucked away in a dark corner, but they want to be somewhere where they are part of traffic, part of things going on, but not being stared at. And they want to play. They really do want play equipment. So much of what we provide for teenagers is very narrow and didactic. You play football here, you skateboard there. And they actually want playful, open spaces where they can hang around with their friends and where they can decide what happens. And the number one thing, which is, if anybody ever takes one thing away from this presentation, is many areas. When you create one big space, it gets dominated by the strongest group. And that's not often teenage girls. And this is what happens in Moogers and in skate parks. So the more you break a space up into different areas, the easier it is for a whole diverse range of groups, not just teenage girls, you know, the boys who don't feel that they can go on the Mooger or the skate park, LGBTQA plus teenagers as well, can all share the space. And I was recently told about a park that's done this in a brilliant way, simply by mowing spaces into the grass and leaving patches of long grass, dividing up the space, stopping it being taken over by one big football match at almost no cost. Next slide, please. So what do teenagers want? We don't have much data in this country at the moment. This is pretty much the first bit of research that anybody has done, which Yorkshire Sport did with women in sport. And it's clear that certainly for girls, what we currently provide isn't working. And they want swings. They also want social seating. This is a question about being active, so that gets left out. They don't want the skate park. But what's really noticeable is it's not even catering that well for boys. Boys want play equipment for people their age. They want trampolines. They want gym equipment. They want different things. We're just not giving teenagers in general what they want, not just teenage girls. So next slide, please. So I'm going to race through. The good news is that this is not all doom and gloom, that there are some really great examples in Europe of spaces that have been designed, co-designed with teenage girls. One of them is Rosens Rodematta in Malmo. If you just go to the next slide, it's a weird park to photograph. So there's a stage, for example, off the left that you can't see. But it was designed in conjunction with a group of teenage girls and young women who well, they wanted different spaces. They also wanted really simple things like exercise bars, gym bars, not big pull-up ones that are part of gym equipment, but just places where they can literally hang around with their friends. A climbing wall, as I said, there's a stage. But what's really interesting is that this was done entirely by teenage girls, but boys are so dominant in public space that this park has ended up being 50-50 boys and girls pretty much. So that's how far you have to push the dial just to get equality. Next slide, please. I love this one. It's such a neat bit of design. What you can do with a Mooger that isn't a Mooger, that is more playful, that has different spaces for different groups, that has shelter, which is really important. And we're so bad at shelter normally. We just stick a shelter on some green and go, that'll do for the teenagers, instead of incorporating it with the play equipment so you can play and be in the space and not just sat there under a grim thing that looks like a rocket ship's crashed badly. Next slide, please. You can see that here, that there's, you know, the shelter is linked in with the equipment. There's different areas within it. There's swings, there's trampolines in the small dots. It's a lovely bit of work. Also note, however, what a small space that is compared with the pitches. Now, I don't know what it's like in Sweden, but in the UK, pitch use is 90 to 95% male. So if we just think about how much space men and boys are taking up versus how much, even that, you know, I'm very grateful that they have done anything with teenage girls, but in terms of how we see ourselves in the public realm, I think that's still quite shocking. Another really interesting approach to this is gender budgeting, because when you look at £300,000 on some new pitches and you go, oh, okay, but so what you're doing is spending £275,000 on men and £25,000 on women and girls, the inequality suddenly becomes incredibly vivid. Next slide, please. This is another lovely one. This, again, Umea have done some really interesting work in sort of taking the lead of Vienna in gender mainstreaming, and they've done really interesting projects across the city. But this was in a park. It's designed by, for, and with teenage girls. And what's interesting is it really worked. Girls are using it even in the early evening, a time when potentially they wouldn't normally feel safe in the park. So it's, you know, it's an intervention that has really worked. Right, I'm nearly running out of time. So quickly, next slide, please. This is how to design a Muga differently. Girls hate Mugas. They don't want to go in them. It's got a 3-meter high fence, narrow entrances, sometimes with a chicane. It's full of teenage boys you may not know. As a grown woman, I don't feel that safe. Teenage girls don't feel they can access them. But look, we can do something different. And it's a stormwater drain or sort of gathering point during times of heavy rain. Win, win, win. Next slide, please. This is, Vienna began gender mainstreaming and they've carried on. What's fascinating about this is it gives permission in the way I was talking about before, because they've labelled it the girls' stage. So that simple intervention gives girls the permission to be there and take up the space. Nobody can tell them they're not meant to be there. They're loitering. Next slide, please. Swings. I'm going to stop off this one because I'm running out of time. Swings are one of the most common things that girls want, and also actually women. We put these onto Twitter and the main reaction was great for teenage girls, but actually I don't care about them. I want some too. But this is, I mean, obviously this is highly aspirational, but it's brilliant. You know, it's open. Everybody's welcome. There's space for the little kids at the back. This is the sort, it's probably still cheaper than a skate park, and it'll benefit a whole lot more people. So there's lots of other lovely stuff. If you just whiz through the next couple of slides, Superkillen in Denmark, really brilliant inclusive space full of teenage girls climbing hills, standing around by the shelters as well. Lots of shelters, lots of space, lots of traffic, brilliant. And just final slide. This is every teenage girl wants. It's a swing and it's social seating. So some things to think about. Thank you.
Swinging social seating, absolutely spot on, Susanna, absolutely perfect. I think one of the really important points you made right at the outset of public space that welcomes enables people to be part of society. And I think that is absolutely fundamental. And if we have, 50% of our population not feeling that public space is for them, then we have a really serious issue on our hands. Perhaps we can debate that in a little while. So we now move to our fourth speaker, Chris Williamson. Chris is an architect and urban designer. He's global chair of Weston Williamson and Partners, and he is an enthusiastic and active advocate of inclusion and diversity. And in fact, for the past 5 years, he has proposed a woman recipient of the Royal Gold Medal for Architecture. Sadly, so far, unsuccessfully. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. I'm honoured to take part. Just a little bit about why I'm passionate about equality for everyone in all aspects of society. In particular, gender equality is taking far too long in all aspects of business, including the environment. I'm personally fortunate to have been the subject of very little discrimination. When I was younger, I used to notice or imagine bias because of my accent and background. And I'm conscious that little things can add up to a lot without role models. For instance, I had a wonderful free grammar school education for which I am eternally grateful and still slightly guilty. It's enabled me to go to university, but although I was encouraged to apply, it was to study art or graphic design. The professions such as architecture were not seen to be appropriate, and I was discouraged from applying by an old school hierarchy view. Also, my mum had raised my brother and I on her own. My 3 uncles and most of our neighbours were constantly commenting how great it would be when I started work and able to contribute to household bills. But my mum hadn't been allowed to study after the age of 14, but was insistent that I did take the opportunity. If I'd listened to the men, I would have left school at 16 and could have possibly been recently retired after a lifetime in retail management. Perhaps I should have. But the only few times I've been personally aware of discrimination since then is being excluded from conversations between graduates of elite universities with wonderful pronunciation, usually triggered by blue or claret neckties with crests on them. At first, it made me feel second rate, less worthy and embarrassed. But now I just find it funny. Charles and Ray Eames have a quote in the garden of their wonderful house. It says, "Always be gracious." So these minor skirmishes for me with discrimination have, however, made me acutely aware of what it must be like for others, individuals and groups, and try to do something about it. So I think diverse voices add such a lot to the process. We should celebrate our differences and bring them to the table. Meetings are much more pleasant with women in the room, and often better with a female chair. I know I will be asked to contribute for one thing, not ignored or shouted down. Having worked predominantly in the world of transport infrastructure for the last 35 years, I've seen a marked, if slow, improvement with women in powerful roles. When we first started work on the Jubilee line and later Crossrail, the only apparent diversity in the room might be that I might be the only one not wearing a tie. Now there are powerful women like Sadie Morgan and Kay Hughes and others in key positions. You can tell I'm very much of the Rutger Bregman view expressed in his book Humankind, that things are getting better, albeit slowly, and we should celebrate our successes while striving for more. And I think there's much more progress to be made in parts of the world. Working recently in the Middle East and elsewhere, there's so much more to be done. I think in the UK, we have moved on a bit. I've been a RIBA council member for 12 years at different times and have served under 6 presidents, only 1 woman. And this is no way critical of the other presidents, but it was noticeable how differently the meetings were chaired and how business was conducted. Women have different sensibilities which need to be encouraged, and I believe they are. Many management books show that leaders used to value male traits. To get into Harvard or Yale, you needed to be assertive, confident, extrovert. Bregman says the measure of a man is his ability to compete with other men, to climb above them. Those attributes were valued in our managers and leaders. Now they're more likely to be introverts, caring, considerate, nurturing. Even where women aren't in these positions, they've had a huge influence. I'm old enough to remember the women of Greenham Common and the influence women had on bringing about change in Ireland. These are big achievements. I delivered 2,000 leaflets for the Women's Equality Party, and although they didn't win a seat, they had a great influence on the coalition government. I love that quote, "For every successful man, there's a woman at the back rolling her eyes." Women have a lot to roll their eyes about. We should talk more about shared success. In my experience, men don't like to show their vulnerability. We don't talk about family, whether the children have measles or whether they're off school. We try to keep home life separate. It isn't, and it can't be. Women seem to be so much better at it. We have a wonderful project director who is in charge of our Paddington team for 8 years, the majority of which on site. In that time, she's had a child and returned to the workplace on the same project, and is an excellent example of how a career and life can be balanced. Like most mothers, she returned more decisive because that's what the role demands. We can have a long career and there's time for life and work. The world is changing. I can't think of many successful businessmen who haven't made enormous compromises to buy that success, or probably more often ask their partners to make those sacrifices. That is, after all, why the divorce courts split everything 50-50. Yet this sacrifice is what we expect of women all the time. It's well documented that men reach for opportunities more than women, have greater confidence in their abilities, often wrongly. These are learnt behaviors, which is why only 25% of senior positions are held by women, and that target of 50% seems so far away. Yet the attributes which leaders now need are more likely to be found in women than men. Of course, it's impossible to predict how the world would be if more decisions had been shaped by women. The next slide. I think a great architect, but being controversial, a dreadful urban designer. I'm sure we have our own versions of how our urban landscape would be different with more women decision makers. Rem Koolhaas says you can't be an architect without being an optimist. And I'm optimistic about the future of our cities, the technological advances and our design skills to change them, especially if they are more subject to female influence and sensibilities. I really can see a green and pleasant future with sustainable technologies. And hopefully we will program our AI, our drones and our robots to have more female characteristics. Detractors will point to other examples where female leaders have been equally controversial, such as Margaret Thatcher or Liz Truss or Cressida Dix. But I think exceptions can always be excused. In my practice, I've always tried to encourage teamwork, and looking at Susanna's interest in sports and interested in play areas and fields. I've learned a lot from sport. I've noticed that when the Lionesses, the English women's team, they play much more of as a team than their male counterparts. Whenever Weston Williamson have a management away days for senior leadership, the facilitator usually concludes, after analysing the way we work, well, looking at you lot individually, I wouldn't employ any of you, but when you work as a team, you're brilliant. And I think that's true for all of us. And Caroline said, as I've advocated for the last 5 years, the RIBA gold medal has had a terrible track record of acknowledging female architects. I've nominated Amanda Levitt for the last 5 years, not only for her own work, but also for the way she was able to work with Jan Kapliki to coax some compromises out of him and enable his amazing designs to be realized. That is an equally amazing gift. To bring out the best in others also brings out the best about oneself and is a gift to be appreciated and valued. I'll continue to campaign for her and for other females and other underappreciated groups to work as part of a team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I'm enjoying this kind of slight theme that we're beginning to get through this of there being perhaps some approaches or ideas and some ways of working that come more naturally to men and others that come more naturally to women, all of which is suggesting that a working environment that is balanced is likely to be so much more productive and so much more interesting. And I really like your first bit about, which kind of just showing that it's not just girls who are potentially put in boxes and not allowed to flourish. It happens to young boys as well. And I think it's so important that we make sure that the opportunities are available to girls and boys across the divide. So thank you very much for that, Chris. I think one of the first questions that has been raised here is that a lack of diversity is often caused by cliques and people who have kind of similar thinking. And I think, Lily, you mentioned that very strongly in this last talk. And I'm reflecting on working with a number of developers where you get this wonderful thing of, we like working with our mates, we like working with people who we trust, we like working with people we know. And I wonder whether there are any members of the panel who would like to comment on how you get people to actually open their eyes and go beyond what is the norm for them, and go beyond working with people who are reflective of their own gender, yes, but ethnicity, yes, but also their own way of thinking. Because I think innovation is something which really is difficult to achieve without diversity in a team. So I wonder if one of the panel members would like to pick up on this.
I'm happy to start, Caroline, since I've kicked off beginning. Well, I just thought actually that the idea that the strongest group dominate playgrounds, I thought was such a wonderful metaphor for the wider world, really, and also even the design of playgrounds had so many messages, I think, for the way we design everything for a more diverse group of users. So I think that, I mean, how do you deal with that? I think even as a male in some banking meetings, I've often felt rather intimidated by that strongest group in the room, and so I feel that that sort of hierarchy that somehow groups tend to have is, as Chris said, I mean, it is changing. I've seen it changing hugely in what I think is a relatively short period of time, 15 to 20 years. It has changed quite dramatically, and it has allowed people to come through who are really now in very powerful positions within our industry. But those are people who have been able to deal with the strongest group in the room, and I think that there is still a lot to be done for those who find it more difficult to deal with the strongest group.
If I may add to that, I think very often on projects which are to do with building and the built environment, the strongest group in the room are the financiers and the client. And it is hugely interesting when you start to see those people taking a lead. So quite often seeing female clients sitting there and saying to a group coming in pitching for work who are all male, saying, frankly, this isn't good enough. And the minute you start to get the powerful people in the room starting to question the status quo, then things start to change, and start to change quite rapidly. I don't know if other people have examples where that might have happened.
Yeah, I would echo Peter's view that, but I think it is also society is changing as well, and our view of leadership is changing, and that's the two go hand in hand. I think. I mean, I think it used to be that those male traits of leadership were dominant, and now companies are more likely to be led by introverts, by people who are more aware, more softer skills, and that naturally favors women. So I think even if women aren't in the top roles, the influence of a different kind of leadership is changing. But I think the last, if we want to get equality in across the board, there's still a long way to go to change that 25% into 50%. but you know, it is happening quite slowly. But the fact that it is still the women that tend to do most of the childcare, again, society is trying to change that. We have more paternity leave. It's more acceptable for carers to share those responsibilities, but it's still not accepted that men take a lead in that.
We have one question here, which is asking whether critical changes should come from the high level, such as mayors, design advocates, or people in the power in the city, or whether they should be more bottom-up approaches. For example, in some similar to those sorts of approaches that Susanna has talked about. I wonder whether there's any people have any views on whether it should be from the top up or the top down or bottom up.
Caroline, if I may come to that, I think that's a great question. And I think it needs to come from both, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of the grassroots actions and activities and initiatives that are happening. I mean, in the UK, especially over the last 2-3 years, Letty, if I can just even give it a grassroots sort of example of how Letty have completely shifted our industry, defined what good looks like from specific benchmarks, and Letty is led by female. And this was a grassroots, it was a very junior sort of group of engineers and architects and designers that are actually coming together to really make a transformation in industry. And I think, of course, with the support of other sort of stronger organizations of the RIBA and others, they have sort of, that carried their wings through the wind, if that's a way of describing it, but they really, it was just a grassroots organization. It wasn't the top-down approach necessarily that has been transforming the industry. And everyone to this date, every single client of ours that comes to us, whether it's for a large-scale project or a small-scale project, every single one of them says, I want to meet Letty targets. So if everyone is talking about these targets that have been defined by these quite, I would say, sort of young and grassroots approach, then I think there is still a great power within the bottom-up approach too, and many examples that Susanna and others have talked about as well. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think we shouldn't wait for women to become in the leadership positions to help influence the industry.
Good idea. We have another question here, which I think is more kind of geared towards Susanna, which is interesting, and it kind of follows on from what we've just been talking about, of finding out more about the co-creation mechanisms that you use to involve teenage girls in the co-design process. How do you manage to get teenage girls engaged?
Well, there's all sorts of answers to this, which range from, it's enormously variable depending on where you are and who you're dealing with and how much time you've got, to shopping vouchers. But to give you a sort of more of an overview, I think the really big issue is that teenage girls don't see public space as being for them. So you have to persuade them. And so you can't just go to them and go, what do you want? It has to be a much slower process of co-creation in which they come to understand that actually they do have a right to public space and that their opinions are worth listening to. And there's all sorts of ways we do this. And, you know, like I said, we sometimes work in schools, sometimes we're working with developers, but a lot of it is about considering that they are the experts, and that they know their area far better than we do. And so that, you know, that their opinions are very much worth having to us. Sometimes we're working a lot with Dr. Julia King from London School of Economics, and she runs a program we're calling Researchers in Residence, where the idea is that in order for teenage girls and young women to really contribute to, you know, in an informed way, to engagement processes, they also need to understand something about the development and building process. So she runs a little curriculum on both urban spaces, feminist city building, all sorts of things, which then enable them to have a really informed input. But really, it's about taking time and listening and making an effort to make them feel it's worthwhile and going to where they are. Because the classic example for parks and public spaces is you talk to the users. But if you only talk to the users, then you'll never reach the people who are excluded.
Excellent. There's a lovely quote here. If you want peace, don't talk to your friends, talk to your enemies. How do we promote conversation between different groups and backgrounds?
Right. Well, I'll kick off again if you like.
Thank you, Peter.
Actually, I mean, if men are the enemy, I would say generally they're not. I just think they're not quite up to the mark in terms of understanding shifts that have happened. But I would say that the general attitude is very different to what it was, as I say, 15 years ago. And I would say now that if we had a panel such as I showed that we had back in 2008, we would get a huge number of protests, not just from activists, you might say, but people in the audience would just think this is not the way the world is today. And I think there has been that a real shift in attitudes, and those people who are maybe not quite on the ball yet are, I don't think they're enemies, but they probably need converting and need to be more aware of what impact they're having on their surroundings, which is probably a negative one.
And if I may add, Caroline, to what Peter is saying, I think if the sort of the natural alignment comes, or when there's a common ground, when people are valuing the same thing, or they're sort of focusing on the same aspect, I think and I always will talk about the impact of the climate change and how it has transformed the way that we as individuals, both within the industry and outside, have been sort of drastically changing our behaviors and our attitudes, and we're re-evaluating what we value in life, in the world. And I think that finding those common grounds, such as the focus on diversity, inclusion, health, and sort of climate change related impacts, is something that actually naturally brings all people from different backgrounds, different disciplines together, because we all want to collectively work together towards the same end goal, and we value the same process in the journey that we're launching on.
I think one of the interesting issues, though, also is money, and it's very easy to be soft and gentle and caring and wanting everyone to be part of a conversation and so on. But at the end of the day, money actually plays a very big role in what happens and what gets built. And I'm wondering whether there is sufficient data being collected, sufficient information being gathered to demonstrate that diversity actually does still make people money. Because without that, I think to some extent we are on a hiding to nothing. I don't know, Lily, whether you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, just to echo that sentiment, I think, it's important to also kind of want to focus on what we're all trying to achieve together on something, and there's a lot of identity politics and there's a lot of identity chat out there, but at the same time, it's important to, at the end of the day, as the money, you want to be working with the best of the best, the most talented people who can truly execute, who can deliver for you. And I would actually think that, the money is going to be happy to consider a wide variety of things if it gets them, to that goal. Can it be sometimes complacent? Is it easier to go to your investment committee using the same X person that you've used for all these other projects, and therefore it's easier to get it across the line? Will you be able to finance something better if you're using a well-known person or entity for X, you know, absolutely, right? And that's a kind of like a barrier that we have to break through. But I think there's you know, I don't think people are necessarily totally closed off by default. It's just that, you know, everyone's got to be a little bit more open and then think about it a bit more. But also, you know, all of us should be kind of thinking a little bit more about, I think, you know, what we have in common, what we're trying to do, which is ultimately, you know, a lot of it's very aligned. You know, maybe not be so bogged down by the identity question as well. I don't know if that makes sense, but hopefully that's my feeling on it.
I've got three things to say. One is that actually we found that developers are really receptive to make space for girls, because it's not just ticking their social value box. That actually, if they create spaces that work for all age groups, they can see that as adding literal value to their development. You know, it's a space that people will stay and remain in, and that they, you know, they can see that as a financial proposition. I had three things to say, now I can only remember two of them. Second one, to go back to being nice. Yeah, I agree. Make Space for Girls is channeled on the furious anger of two slightly cross-menopausal women. And I frankly think we need more of this. And let's just be nice. Being nice, let's face it, 50 years on has not dismantled the patriarchy. I think a bit of crossness and a bit of speech and a bit of actually going, excuse me, this is not okay, is really called for. Personal opinion only. The third thing is actually, there's one thing that we've really left out of this, and this is the law. One of the key factors behind the fact that we decided to set up as a charity is the Equality Act, because it's very clear that, you know, we deliberately focus on a small space where the inequality is absolutely clear, with the idea that this is the tool that levers the lid off the paint pot. If people look at inequality here, they will start to see it in other places. But it's very clear that the Equality Act has teeth if people use it. Councils have a legal duty not just to consider equality in their decision making, but to act to redress discrimination. This doesn't just apply to teenage girls. It applies to disability. It applies to racial discrimination. And when we go on, you know, when we're part of events that are, you know, addressing broader issues of diversity, everybody says the same thing. The law is there. We just need to use it. So I think the Equality Act, and thinking about things in these terms, why don't we have decent equality impact assessments in planning? Because then you just look at a pitch and you just go, this is not equal. Whereas when people they do the pitches, they go, oh, maybe we need better changing rooms for the girls. It's like, no, look at the giant inequality that's in front of you. So also using the law we have, I think, is really important. Sorry, that's not as relevant to a lot of international views of this, but as I said, that you all have your own laws, go and hunt them down with them.
Thank you, Susanna. We have a question from one of our viewers in Lithuania, so welcome, who wanted to talk about the division of certain professions by gender, and I think that was something that, Chris, you mentioned in your talk. How do we try to change things in many of those professions so women are not oppressed and are not afraid to choose what are predominantly male professions?
Yeah, I think role models are incredibly important. They were to me, the lack of them, and it is the more you see of women, you know, that Mina gave some fantastic examples of, you know, the leaders. And I mean, there's a dreadful fallout of women in architecture. I think it's something like 25% of women that go into architecture come out the other end. It's about half, twice what it is for men. It's so I think it's a big problem. You know, the stickability of a long course. There's a lot of different factors in architecture and hopefully the more diverse ways into the profession will help. It's an incredibly long career. I mean, I'm 66 and I'm still looking forward to the next 20 years. And I'm looking, you know, it's perfectly reasonable to have 5 or 6 years out to look after the kids or to have a family, and come back again, as those examples I showed of our office. And so I think we have a lot of school children coming into our office, and they always say, how do I do this? How do I come and work here? And you just have to say, well, first of all, you have to pass your GCSEs and then your A levels, and then it's one step at a time. But being with them all the way through that journey, it's not something that just happens. It's a gradual process, and just trying to make sure that they don't drop out at any of those stages along the way, and providing different good role models for them to aspire to, I think is.
And Lily, the way you were talking about your MBA course, I wonder whether it's similar on the financial side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in our industry, you know, if you work hard at it, you're able to kind of bring in women at you know, more junior levels, what we call the analysts and associates. And there's a huge dropout rate as that moves on. And sometimes it's not necessarily dropping out of the industry as a whole, like they'll stay within a real estate fund, but they'll maneuver themselves into, you know, more asset management role or investor relations or something, you know, that takes them out of the investment space. And that's something I definitely saw amongst a lot of my female peers as I was coming up. We hope that happens less, and that, you know, they feel that they can, you know, as more of the women come through, that they, you know, that they're, you know, we're quite capable, and if anything, kind of bring, you know, a wide set of skill sets to these principal roles, and hopefully that changes. It you know, it's hard for this to happen overnight. And I think, you know, as Peter said earlier, you know, so much has happened already, more so than I definitely ever expected as I was, I guess, growing up in this space. But I think when you're talking about the big decisions makers in a room, it's, yeah.
It is.
We'll get there.
I think the point Chris made about role models is really interesting. And actually, one of the other things which we have just done as part of the diversity project is to pull together a mentoring toolkit for people to use to help to mentor people in thinking about diversity and gender diversity. And I think those sorts of things, toolkits and anything that can really help people to be better role models, to be people that the next generation can look up to, I think is absolutely critical. We've run out of questions in the Q&A section, and we are very close to running out of time. So I would like to just summarize by saying thank you so much for attending, and thank you also to our amazing panelists. And I do hope you all enjoyed the session as much as I did. It has been such a privilege to run this event, for which we are indebted to the European Union Horizon 2020 project and its funding of the diversity project itself. As part of the diversity project programme, the Equilibrium Network is planning to run a series of events, one every three months, of which this is the first. These will consider a number of different issues that will enable or are hindering our ability to deliver our aim of enabling women to have equal influence in the design and delivery of the built environment. Our next event will be looking to the use of language, finding ways to communicate and include an audience through spoken, written, and visual tools. It will be taking place in June, and we will be sure to alert you once the date and programme have been finalised. And I look forward to seeing you all there. In the meantime, if you would like to see this webinar again, we will be posting a link on the Equilibrium Network website in the coming days. So it remains for me finally to say thank you all to our panel, thank you to our audience, thank you to Diversity, the European Union Horizon Project, Horizon 2020, and finally then, goodbye. Thank you.